So as Lisa noted, I'm going to review Section O, Special Treatments, Procedures, and Programs. So first, I'm going to summarize the coding instructions for the revised assessment data element O0110, Special Treatments, Procedures, and Programs. And then together we'll walk through a few scenarios in order to apply the coding instructions and principles to practice coding this data element. So again, we're just focusing on this one data element, O0110. So here's a screenshot of the item as it is now. As you may recall from the didactic presentation, if you were able to watch those, this data element has changed. There are quite a few new sub-elements under the headings of chemotherapy, for example, IV, CPAP, BiPAP. And there are two new columns. One is for admission, on admission, and the other is for discharge. And then while a resident is the third column. So let's just walk through some of the coding instructions. For column A, on admission, you're going to check all treatments, procedures, and programs that were received by, performed on, or participated in by the resident on days 1 to 3 of a SNF PPS stay. So that's starting with A 2400B, which is the start of the most recent Medicare stay. And if no treatments, procedures, or programs were received or performed in the 3-day assessment period, you're going to check Z, none of the above. For while a resident, you'll check all of these that the resident received or performed after admission, entry, or re-entry to the facility and within the last 14 days. And as with on admission, if none apply, you'd also check Z, none of the above. And lastly, for column C, at discharge, check all treatments, procedures, and programs received by, performed on, or participated in by the resident in the last 3 days of the SNF PPS stay. And that's ending with A 2400C, which is the end date of the most recent Medicare stay. And as with while a resident, if none apply, you'll also check Z, none of the above. So let's just walk through our first scenario. A resident was discharged from the hospital following an acute care inpatient stay for pneumonia. On admission to the SNF for a PPS stay, the resident requires continuous oxygen via nasal cannula, which is defined as more than 14 hours per day. He also has IV antibiotics via a peripheral line. The resident received these treatments during the first 5 days of the stay. So now how would you code O0110 column A on admission for this resident? I'll give you some time to consider this item. And I don't think we're going to have the polling for this one, so feel free to jot your answer down, or you can even type it into the chat. I can see quite a few of you are typing into the chat. Okay, so compare this to what you had written down. You should have checked off C1, O2 therapy, and C2 continuous. Also H1 IV medications and antibiotics. And then in addition, O1 IV access and O2 peripheral. So let's look at the rationale on the next slide. So this resident received the treatments of continuous oxygen therapy for more than 14 hours a day via nasal cannula, as well as IV antibiotics via a peripheral line for the first 5 days of their PPS stay, which was within that time period for on admission. So let's just add a bit more information to the same resident in order to continue coding. Once the IV antibiotic course is completed on day 5, the peripheral IV is discontinued. By the end of week 2, 14 days, the resident is improving and requires oxygen only intermittently for 2 hours a day. And by day 17, there is no further supplemental oxygen need. The resident is discharged to home 4 days later on day 21. So now, based on this new information, let's consider how to code O0110 columns B while a resident and C at discharge. Again, I'll give you some time to consider the answers and feel free to add in the chat or just jot it down. You can see quite a few of you are writing into the chat. Thank you for doing that. Okay, so you can see here for column B, while a resident, only oxygen therapy is checked. And for C, at discharge, none of the above. Now let's look at the rationale. So for column B, while a resident, the resident continued to receive supplemental oxygen for 2 hours a day until day 17, which was within those last 14 days. The type of oxygen delivery is not coded in column B while a resident. So you'll notice a lot of the sub-elements are not coded for that middle column B. The IV peripheral line and IV antibiotics were all discontinued by day 5, so these no longer applied. So column C, at discharge, the resident no longer required supplemental oxygen during the last 3 days of the PPS stay, since the oxygen stopped at day 17, and the discharge occurred 4 days later on day 21. Okay, so now let's look at another scenario. This resident was discharged from the acute care hospital and admitted to a hospital swing bed in a SNF for a PPS stay following a pathologic fracture related to small cell lung cancer and bone mets. While hospitalized, they were found to have a blood clot. IV heparin was administered via a previously placed central line port. The IV heparin continued to be administered during the first week of the PPS stay until they were transitioned to a subcutaneous heparin. The resident also continued receiving oral chemotherapy medications as ordered throughout their stay. So how would you code O0110 column A on admission for this resident? I'm going to give you some time to consider it. And again, please feel free to put your answers in the chat or just jot them down. Well, I can see quite a few people are putting into the chat. Thank you. Okay, so for column A, on admission, you should have checked A1 chemotherapy and A3 oral. And you should have also have checked H1 medications and H4 anticoagulant. And in addition, you would check IV access and O4 central for this resident. Let's look at the rationale. So for on admission, the resident has a central line for IV access and is still receiving IV heparin, an anticoagulant, when admitted to the facility. And they're also taking oral chemotherapy medication, and these treatments were all provided on days 1 to 3 of the PPS stay. So now let's continue with the same resident scenario. So over the 2-week period of the SNF stay, the resident was placed on subcutaneous heparin. The IV anticoagulant was discontinued on day 8, and the port remained in place and was flushed daily by the nursing staff. On discharge, the resident was referred for home health services, for physical therapy, and for nursing to continue to flush the port and teach administration of a newly ordered oral anticoagulant. The discharge orders included oral chemotherapy and returning for a follow-up visit with the outpatient oncology team. So given this additional information, how would you code columns B while a resident and at discharge for this resident? I see quite a few of writing into the chat. Thank you. Okay, and here's how you should have answered. So you can compare this to what you have. For while a resident, you're going to check chemotherapy, IV medications, and IV access. And you can see, again, a lot of the sub-elements are not included in that time frame for that column. At discharge, you would check chemotherapy and oral, since that continued throughout the stay, and IV access and central. IV medications would not be checked. Let's look at the rationale. So for column B, while a resident, the resident continued the IV anticoagulant heparin until day 8. Sub-Q heparin is not an IV anticoagulant and is not coded here. The central line remained in place and the port was flushed daily. For IV medications, you do not code flushes to keep an IV access port patent. At discharge, the resident still had the central line port in place, and they continued with the oral chemotherapy through the last 3 days before discharge. Okay, so we have one more last scenario to practice coding of this data element. So for this resident, they were admitted to the SNF for a PPS stay after surgery for a fractured hip. Due to a history of renal failure, they received hemodialysis 3 times per week. The contracted end-stage renal disease facility staff provided dialysis services at the SNF via the AV fistula while the resident was in for rehab. Starting on the day of admission and throughout the stay, in addition to hemodialysis, the resident also received physical therapy and independently managed their own CPAP for obstructive sleep apnea. So based on this scenario, how would you code column A on admission for this resident? You can see a lot of answers going into the chat. Thank you. Okay, so for this resident scenario, O0110, column A on admission would be coded as indicated here. G1, non-invasive mechanical ventilator, and G3 CPAP would be checked. And you'd also check off J1 for dialysis and J2 for hemodialysis. And let's look at the rationale. So on admission, the resident is receiving hemodialysis and self-manages their CPAP. So both will continue while they're in the SNF. The CPAP is coded whether the resident, the staff, or another person places or removes the CPAP mask or the device. So just a bit more detail on this resident. 5 days before discharge, an infection developed at the surgical site, resulting in a need for IV antibiotics via a peripheral line. The resident wished to return home, so after 5 days of receiving IV antibiotics, the resident was discharged with a saline lock to maintain access for the remaining doses of the IV antibiotics, which they would receive at home. The discharge occurred on day 21. Discharge with services from the local home health agency were arranged and included orders for the continuation of the hemodialysis at the outpatient ESRD clinic, CPAP, wound care, and the IV antibiotics for the remaining doses. The resident's last hemodialysis while a resident at the SNF occurred the day before discharge. So given this information, how would you code O0110 columns B while a resident and C at discharge for this resident? Take a minute to consider your answers and jot them down. There's a lot to check off here, so I can see a lot of answers coming in the chat. Okay, so here's what you should have had for columns B while a resident and column C at discharge. You can see for the last column that you'd also be checking off all of those sub-elements for each of those categories. And I'll go through the rationale. So the resident continued with the hemodialysis and CPAP throughout the PPS stay. The IV antibiotics via peripheral line began 1 week prior to discharge and continued post-discharge. At discharge, during the last 5 days of the PPS stay, the resident continued with the treatments of hemodialysis, their CPAP, and the IV antibiotics. So let's just review a few key insights for coding this data element. You're going to review the resident's medical record to determine whether or not the resident received or performed any of the treatments, procedures, or programs within the assessment period that's defined in each column, including on admission and at discharge. Complete the data element including all of the new subcategories, for example, IV access subcategories of peripheral, midline, or central. And these are coded whether received by, performed on, or participated in by the resident. You do not include subcutaneous administration of anticoagulant medications, and you do not code flushes to keep IV access port patent or IV fluids without a medication.
Thank you, Brenda. Our first question for you is for items 0011001 IV access and 0011002 peripheral. If a resident is admitted with peripheral IV access for seizure precautions or PRN use for hypertensive medications only, necessitating saline flushes, is it correct to code both 01 IV access and 02 peripheral?
Yes, IV access refers to a catheter inserted into a vein for a variety of clinical reasons, including the long-term medication administration for large volumes of blood or fluid, frequent access for blood samples, IV fluid administration, TPN, or in some instances, the measurement of CVP. When a resident has IV access and that access is peripheral, you would check both 0011001 IV access and 0011002 peripheral, even if only accessed as needed for medication or for flushes to maintain patency. When coding 00110 special treatments, procedures, and programs, the items are first listed as broad descriptions or categories for these procedures considered parent items, and then they're followed by more specific types, which are referred to as the child items.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Question 2, would a Quinton catheter, a large bore central venous catheter used for dialysis, placed in the jugular or femoral vein, be classified as a central line?
IV access identifies a catheter inserted into a vein for a variety of clinical reasons, including the long-term medication administration or large volumes of fluid, frequent access for blood samples, IV fluid administration, and some instances of measurement. So when a resident has IV access 0011001, and that access is centrally located, you would check both 0011001 and 04 for central, for PIC line or tunnel port or those kinds of lines. So yes.
Thank you. Our next question, if a resident is receiving chemotherapy not related to cancer, how is this item coded? For example, oral or injection chemotherapy for autoimmune diseases.
So yes, as stated in the coding tips in the MDS RAA Manual 3.0 version 1.1811, 00110A1 chemotherapy. You code any type of chemotherapy medication administered as an antineoplastic for cancer treatment, given by any route in this item. Medications coded here are those actually used for cancer treatment. So each medication has to be evaluated to determine its reason before you code it here.
Okay. And our final question is for 00110C1 oxygen therapy, the guidance manual specifically states to code oxygen administered via mask or cannula, etc., delivered to a resident to relieve hypoxia. If there is no documentation of hypoxia, but the resident reported shortness of breath and the oxygen was used, can oxygen still be marked?
So again, you would check all treatments, programs, and procedures that are part of the current care plan or treatment plan during those assessment periods. If the oxygen is part of the resident's current care or treatment plan, regardless of its reason for use, you would check C1 oxygen therapy. For the on admission and discharge periods, per the REA user's manual, specific definitions in determining whether the oxygen is coded continuous, delivered like more than 14 hours per day or equal to, and then intermittent oxygen that's less than that. Hope that answers it, Lisa.
Yes, I think so. Thank you. And thank you for all your responses, Brenda.